Men are open about their feelings. It's just that people don't always see how they're open about their feelings. And there's a lot to do with how people communicate to each other. So, despite what people might think, men are often quite sensitive and very easily affected by the words that people express, that they hear, that people say about them. There's a lot to do with trust as well, and people feeling comfortable to be open as men around other people. So, one of the most common myths with mental health that's still live and kicking today, particularly with men, is that they don't talk about their feelings. Now, I can see why that's a view that persists because there's a narrative, there's a tradition, there's a history behind it. As men, you can only be as open as the environment that you're exposed to and how you're conditioned and how those older than you, those you look up to, how they relate to you. And if people are not talking about their feelings and their emotions, then you're not going to learn to do that either. So it's going to go hand in hand, and you're less likely to be open with your emotions around other people, and you're less likely to talk, you're less likely to be open, to open up and be as expressive with other people. Um, Often with men as well, we're slightly less social than women in particular. So we often have like smaller groups of friends and more close-knit relationships with people compared to women. There are lots of studies out there around this. I'll link some in the description below so you can do a bit of digging if you want to find out a bit more about that. But yeah, there are lots of studies out there around this kind of thing as well, to do with how different social groups interact with each other through generations as well. Um, but we are seeing a generational shift now. So how I relate to people now is very different to how my parents relate to people. How the different generations relate to each other and communicate, and societies that we're brought up in, that we grow up in, and that we're influenced by, has a huge impact on how we relate to each other. So my children have grown up in the world of iPads and online communication and phones. Everything's touchscreen, everything's internet based. I didn't have that kind of stuff when I was younger. So, how we related to each other, how we communicated to each other, how we made friends, how we engaged was much more kind of typical in-person stuff. You know, it's not to say children now don't do that, but I think there are definitely these very different influences on how people behave, how people react and relate to each other. There's a lot more real-time 24/7 ways of communicating now that wasn't there before. If you were at school, you would see your friends there, and then if they didn't live near you, you wouldn't see them until the next time you're at school. Whereas now, you're on, you might be on Facebook, you might be on TikTok, Instagram, whatever, and you're picking up your communication with them like outside of school, like weekends, evenings, all that stuff. So it's all very different now, and that's not necessarily been a quick change in society, but I think it has a big influence. Just generationally, how different people of different ages communicate and relate, and what they expect from each other as well. So traditionally, older generations did everything in person. You know, people talked more when they're on the train, when they're traveling. People were much more easily able to befriend strangers and be more trusting with other people, perhaps, than what younger generations like mine are. We're much more likely now to be cautious of other people and less likely to be relating to strangers. You'd keep to yourselves, you'd be thinking about risks and worries and dangers in the world, because we know a lot more, because the way communication works now in society. So to reel this back into men talking about their feelings, I think that there are a lot of perceptions around how men communicate with different people about their feelings because of their home life and their upbringing, and what's expected of them, and also what we need. You know, I mean, me personally, I'm the kind of person that doesn't need that many friends. I don't need to be able to have lots of people around me all the time. I'm very comfortable in my own company. A lot of people are comfortable in their own company, but we still need to be able to communicate and reach people. You know, we are still social creatures, but the kinds of relationships we have with people can be very wide ranging and can be quite different. So I can get a lot of social stimulation just by traveling, just by being around other people, just by being at work, all that kind of stuff. I don't feel the need to have lots of friends and to be constantly messaging people and to feel like I'm constantly connected to people and I need to be updating everybody on everything I'm doing. Um, and I know that there are a lot of people like that. And that's not a bad thing. It's just a different way of living. It's just a different way of communicating. So, but I do still feel the need to offload. You know, videos like this are quite helpful for that kind of thing. When it comes down to actually talking about your feelings, I do think men today are much more open than they used to be. So I'm doing these videos and this is a way for me to talk about my feelings. You know, if you check my kind of back catalogue on my channel, you'll see that there's a lot of vulnerability. There's a lot of me being open about my experiences, and I'm quite comfortable to communicate with people about my experiences in life and how different things, different situations have affected me, and how I've been able to overcome different challenges, what I've learned, and how I related to people around those issues as well. So that's my approach, that's my journey. Everybody is different like that. Um, I'm just going to jump ahead because there's some roadworks going on just here. So I'll just give me a sec. There we go. That's a bit better. So men are open about their feelings. It's just that people don't always see how they're open about their feelings. And there's a lot to do with how people communicate to each other. So despite what people might think, men are often quite sensitive and very easily affected by the words that people express, that they hear, that people say about them. There's a lot to do with trust as well, and people feeling comfortable to be open as men around other people. And men often need to feel safe opening up because they're making themselves vulnerable. And if they're not used to being vulnerable with other people, they're not used to feeling comfortable, then, you know, they're trying to open up in what could be quite an uncomfortable, you know, talking about uncomfortable topics, something that they're not used to doing, not familiar with, then they're trying to tread new ground. You know, I'd certainly feel for myself that's something I've done over the last few years when it comes to my mental health in particular. So it's an area that people don't necessarily even understand. You know, I personally have been on a huge journey of my own around my mental health, and you know, it's not been that I've had 40 years of experience behind me already. You know, age is just a number when it comes to your mental health and your ability to talk about your emotions, because we're not all born and then growing up in societies where it's normal from day one to be talking about our emotions. It's not something we're used to, it's something we have to learn to do. And so that's something that men have to contend with. And I think everyone else has to have a degree of patience around that, and sympathy and ability to kind of understand, listen, and relate to that. Because if you're not starting from that kind of baseline of men making themselves vulnerable so that they can try to learn, they can progress, they want to be able to deal with situations in life, then it's going to be very difficult for men to move forward, and there's going to be barriers in place there. And as a lot of people probably know, men can be incredibly defensive, and particularly around their emotions, that's a really challenging area because they can have a bad experience and that will put them off from being open again with a particular person or in a particular situation. So that's going to be very difficult for that person to then decide to go, I'm going to try that again. I'm going to do that again with someone else, or let's try and address this topic again. it can be very challenging, and it's not worth the effort. It's easier to say no. It's easier to not try again. It's easier to just bury your emotions, bury your situation, and not find a way to be expressive with people if you're, as a man, not getting the response that you want from somebody. We all do it. We all do it. I'm sure women do that as well, and people of all genders. I'm sure they are just as much like men in lots of ways when it comes to how they deal with their emotions, how they deal with their feelings, and how they express them, talk about them, relate to other people with them. But it's a particular kind of trope with men, as the theme of this video, that men typically don't talk about their feelings. And it's not that they do. It's just that it can be very difficult, I think, for men to find a kind of comfort zone where there are people that are close to them, that they can trust, that they can relate to. Men, I personally find, don't like gossip. And so they want to be able to talk to people in confidence, that they're not going to be spreading what they say to somebody else, or, having those kind of knock-on effects of how people, they don't want to have those sort of knock-on effects. And so it's very important, I think, that when men are open, that they're in a trusting environment or with someone that they trust and that they can be comfortable with. So if that's not the case, then it's less likely that men are going to be talking about their feelings, really. And as perhaps a lot of people know, most men hide their feelings by being funny, by using humour. And that's something that I think a lot of people have ingrained in them from an early age. Groups of men often have a lot of banter, they have a lot of jokes, they have a lot of entertainment that they drum up in a kind of group mentality. And you see that today as adults, like in the pub, when you think about football crowds, when you think about different situations where you've got lots of men, people get rowdy, people are having a good time. There's always a lot of humour floating around. And that often gets used as a mask, I think, to hide people's feelings. Like they might, instead of being open and vulnerable about a situation when they're talking to someone, they might just use sarcasm. They might just make some flippant remarks, or they might just change the subject, because they're not comfortable talking about something. And humour often plays a big part in that. And I think a lot of people perhaps don't always see that with humour, like that it's actually a defence mechanism. And men do learn from a very early age to use humour as a way to cover how they're feeling, or to avoid talking about a difficult subject, or to continue talking about a difficult subject. So, as you're probably getting from this video, this is a very meaty topic. The whole world of men talking about their feelings, and why men don't talk about their feelings, and some of the challenges that they do have when they try to talk about their feelings. So I may try and cover some of this in another video, because I think there's a lot to dig into here, actually. And there's a lot of my own experience that I'm comfortable to share around this as well, because, I've certainly had my fair share of challenges when it comes to trying to be open about how I feel about things. But yeah, there's a lot to be said for society, I think, and how people are conditioned to act a certain way, to behave a certain way, and the different environments that we exist in, and the different kinds of identities that men have in different places. The role of the husband, the role of the father, your role at work, your role as a friend, and the kinds of friends you have, and all these sorts of things really do influence how comfortable men feel about talking about their feelings. So thank you for listening, and as I say, I'll dig into some of this in another video. In the meantime, if you've got any experience to share, particularly if you're a man and you have had challenges around opening up about your feelings. It'd be really interesting to hear how you got on with that. And if you've got any tips about what you could do, what someone else could do to try and overcome those challenges with talking about your feelings, please pop a comment down below, and I'll make sure to comment back to you as well. All right, take care. See you on the next video.